Please be seated. It is called the greatest story ever told. Life come from death. It is the story written in the Gospels and washed over us this morning, ancient words depicting what happened. The Bible tells the story Jesus is a threat to the state for his challenge to the powers and principalities of the world, for calling forth love without bounds. He was tried and put to death by crucifixion. His body was laid in a tomb. For 3 days it seemed that death was the end, but after 3 days, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and found it empty. And then she encountered the risen Christ and went and told the disciples the good news. What is not recounted in the Gospels is the actual moment of the resurrection. Writers know this is a little trick. If you leave something out of the story, you leave a certain moment out of the story, it lets the reader's imagination get big and excited about what the actual moment was. The gospel writers don't write about the stone actually being rolled away or the emergence of the living Christ. That scene is not captured in Holy Scripture. We get the death, we get the burial, and then there is Jesus. So there is, if you will, a holy space in our story. John Crossan, a preeminent New Testament scholar, and his spouse, Sarah, spent 15 years tracking what artists have done with the moment of resurrection across the Christian world. How artists have rendered that holy space in the story. We know, of course, that artists don't work in isolation. They are members of communities and worlds. And so we can often look at art to tell us how a culture was experiencing or understanding their world, how they were responding to the world around them. The Crossan's seminal work is beautifully cataloged and explored in their book, Resurrecting Easter. To understand their research, we have to understand a pivotal moment in Christian history, the Great Schism, when there was a split in the year 1054 of the church east and west. The Eastern Church, what we know as Eastern Orthodox, grounded in Greek philosophy, and the Western Church, the Catholics, grounded in Roman law. Now, I am no church historian, and there is one in our midst. It's a little intimidating to do church history with him right there, but my apologies for this cut-to-the-chase version of what happened with the church. But it came down to this. The Roman bishop in the West wanted to be the boss of the bishop in the East. He wanted to be in charge of their polity and their theology, and the Eastern bishop wouldn't have it. So he excommunicated the Roman bishop, who then quickly returned the favor and excommunicated the Eastern bishop. It does sound a little familiar. We are not Catholic, but our polity and our theology has been deeply influenced by the Western tradition. So the Crossans go about digging deeply into the ancient understanding of resurrection, the resurrection moment in the ancient world, and they find that there was a tremendous and significant difference in how the East and the West understood the event of Easter. In the West, resurrection had been understood as an individual event. Jesus, all by his lonesome self, rose from the dead on Easter morning. In the Eastern Church, The Easter moment is understood as a universal resurrection. The Christ brings the whole world with him as he rises on Easter morning. So the essential difference in Eastern and Western art about the resurrection is this. In the East, in the West, Christ is singularly coming up out of a tomb, one being. In the East, as Christ steps out of the tomb, he is reaching back into the world. And he is grabbing the hands of Adam and of Eve and of Abel and of Abraham and of Sarah. He's bringing the world with him. We could say the East is the East and the West is the West. And we are doing just fine with our stuff, except that we really are not. And because the first images of the resurrection as a universal movement of Christ reaching back to the world didn't originate in the East, but they originated in the West before the church split. It is our origin, this sense of a universal resurrection. It is what is primary and what our most early understanding of the resurrection, the space of our story is. So do you remember Nicodemus? He was the little Pharisee that was always running around after Jesus asking questions. There's a gospel that is associated with him. It's dated to the 600s, so 600-ish years after Christ's death. But in it, Nicodemus says, "What is marvelous is not that Jesus arose, but that he did not arise alone." That was the theology. That was the understanding of the resurrection moment. So this solitary resurrection fed a singular focus on the resurrection of Jesus as a sacrifice. It fed a notion that God is way up there and disappointed in us. And that God uses this singular resurrection moment of Jesus to be our scapegoat. It's so sad, isn't it? Scapegoat. Richard Rohr describes the origin of this idea of a scapegoat. It's right there in the book of Leviticus. The priest lays his hand on an escaping goat. He places all the sins of the Jewish people from the previous year onto this animal. And then the goat is beaten with reeds and thorns, and it's driven out into the desert. It was a vividly symbolic act that helped to unite and free the people in the short term. Instead of owning their sins, the ritual allowed people to export them elsewhere. The Crossan's pointed to an original and central understanding that the resurrection is not something done on our behalf. Resurrection is not done to us alone. Resurrection is done through us. Resurrection does not come upon the world, it emerges through the world. This is what Crossan has to say. All great religions offer humanity parables bigger than themselves. So also in resurrection. When Christ, rising from the dead, after being executed for nonviolent resistance against violent imperial injustice, grasps the hands of Adam and Eve, he creates a parable of possibility and a metaphor of hope for all humanity. Call the goats back. Resurrection does not happen out there. Resurrection is within us. We also rise from the tomb. We are not passive to the moment of resurrection. It is the greatest story ever told, and we are meant to live the story. James Wright, the writer and poet, had an experience, and he wrote about it in a poem. I'm going to read it to you. It's short. The poem is called Lying in a Hammock at William Duffy's Farm in Pine Island, Minnesota. The poem is about as long as the title. Overhead, I see the bronze butterfly asleep on the black trunk, blowing like a leaf in the green shadow. And down in the ravine behind the empty house, the cowbells follow one another into the distance of the afternoon. To my right, in a field of sunlight between two pines, the dropping of last year's horses blaze up like golden suns. I lean back as the evening darkens and comes on. A chicken hawk floats over looking for home. I have wasted my life. The man in the hammock sees the world around him as if for the first time. And in that moment, he's reaching to the world. It's not just him. It is not just him. It is not just him. It's what happened at the tomb. There is the risen Christ, and he reaches to Mary Magdalene. And she reaches to the disciples. The disciples reached to the world. A good pal shared with me an online course about living without fear recently. One of the teachers told a story in the video series about Bernie Glassman, a Zen Buddhist teacher who died last year. So Bernie Glassman was at a conference speaking about Avalokitesvara, a beloved bodhisattva in Buddhism. You actually know this God, this bodhisattva. You have seen the images. He is depicted with 1,000 arms coming from his body. So Bernie Glassman is at this conference, and he is speaking about Avalokitesvara and the compassion that 1,000 arms brings. And a man stood and said, I am all for compassion, but I only have 2 arms. So Bernie Glassman says, everyone put up your hands in the air. And they did it. The people at the conference did it. So let's do it here. There we go. There may not be 1,000 arms, but I bet you there's maybe 600 arms. Look at all these arms. Jesus came from the tomb and brought the world into the work of resurrection. Reaching out was part of the resurrection. For him to rise, he had to reach back. He could not rise alone, and nor can we. How far can your arms reach? We need to bring back the goats. What is marvelous is not that he arose, but that he did not arise alone. The earliest Christians, before we were divided and cut off from one another in history, understood that we rise with Christ only to the extent that we bring others along. That our spiritual lives are meant to be lives lived not in isolation, but in community. That my own resurrection is bound up with your resurrection, and our resurrection is bound up with the resurrection of the world. That resurrection did not happen once 2,000 years ago. Christ came from the tomb so that you would come from your own tomb, that I would come from mine, and that we would reach these arms, that we would not waste our lives, that we would not waste our resurrection. We are going to baptize baby May here in a moment. And you will be asked as a community of faith if you will bring her up in this resurrected life. We begin this morning reaching to a child, reaching out resurrection. Before we do that, we're going to do something very important. And I need all the children to come sit up here around the font. You're going to be able to see the baptism, but we've got something else to do because I need your help in this very important thing because we've got to call the goat back. Oh, yeah. We've got to stop putting the work of resurrection on the goat because the work of rising belongs to us. So we're going to stand right here and we're going to call Daisy. Let's call Daisy. Come on, Daisy. Come on, Daisy. This is Daisy the goat and Marcia. Hey, Daisy. Welcome back. Come on, Daisy. Hey, Daisy. Oh, there's some carrots in the kitchen, between the stoves. Carrots between the stove. Marcia, here's some carrots. Oak. Yeah. Here, you want a carrot? See if you, that may be too big. Okay, so I'm going to hammer home the lesson. It is not meant to be one resurrection. We're all the goat, right? Amen. Okay. Marcia, will she let you just kneel here with us and stay for the baptism?
Me?
Yeah. Can you
If I kneel, I may never get up.
Oh, dear.
We'll give it a try.
Or it'd be fun if she wanted to stay. Okay, we're going to have a baptism with a goat now.